Hello everyone. I will share real stories that I know and I'm sure you will like them.
The warm water ran over my hands, soap suds swirling in the sink as I methodically scrubbed the last of the dinner plates. The house was quiet now, the clatter of dishes and the faint hum of the overhead light the only sounds breaking the stillness. It was one of those peaceful moments I rarely got to enjoy, a small pocket of solitude at the end of a long evening. The dinner had been pleasant, filled with conversation and laughter, but now, as I stood alone in the kitchen, the quiet felt almost too heavy. My thoughts drifted as I worked, the rhythmic motion of scrubbing and rinsing oddly soothing. The warmth of the water seeped into my skin, washing away the exhaustion of the day. I allowed myself to get lost in it, my mind floating between the gentle sounds of water and the distant echo of memories from earlier in the evening. I barely noticed the soft footsteps behind me until I felt his presence, close, but not intruding. A low voice cut through the quiet. "You always do this alone?" I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse quickening just slightly at the unexpected company. My husband's best friend, Jake, leaned against the counter, watching me with an expression that was unreadable, casual yet intent. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms resting on the edge of the counter, as if he had been standing there for longer than I realized. A soft chuckle escaped me as I turned back to the sink. "Someone has to," he hummed, stepping closer. "You should let someone help." Before I could respond, his fingers brushed over mine, stopping my movements entirely. The warmth of his hand was unexpected, his touch deliberate but gentle. My breath hitched, my body suddenly aware of the space, or lack thereof, between us. His touch lingered, just barely skimming my damp skin, his thumb tracing a faint circle against my wrist. The soap suds between us felt insignificant, dissolving under the weight of the moment. The warmth of his body so close sent a slow, crawling awareness through me, something I wasn't prepared for but didn't immediately pull away from. I swallowed, staring at the soapy water as his hand remained, his grip neither tightening nor retreating. The air between us shifted, stretching thin, heavy with something unspoken. The distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint dripping of the faucet suddenly seemed louder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Jake," I started, but my voice came out softer than I intended, the hesitation in it clear. His grip didn't tighten, but he didn't let go either. "You don't always have to do everything yourself." I wasn't sure if he meant the dishes. His presence was warm, steady, familiar yet different now, in a way I couldn't quite define. I should have moved, should have pulled away, should have said something that would break the moment and send us back to safer ground. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed still, letting the weight of his touch settle against my skin, wondering, just for a second, if I really wanted him to move away. His fingers flexed slightly, a barely noticeable motion, but enough to send a slow ripple through my senses. His breath was steady, close enough that I could feel the faintest trace of warmth on my shoulder. The sound of the water running down the drain filled the silence, but my focus was entirely on the quiet, electric tension between us. He exhaled slowly, almost as if he was weighing his next words. "You work too hard." A small, breathy laugh left my lips before I could stop it. "Since when do you notice?" Jake tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Since always." The words settled between us, heavier than I expected. I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes, and for the first time, I saw something deeper there, something careful, something restrained. His fingers slipped away, but not before brushing one last time against my wrist, leaving a lingering warmth that refused to fade. He took a small step back, just enough to put distance between us, but not enough to erase what had just passed between us. "I should let you finish," he murmured, his voice quieter now, as if acknowledging that something had shifted. I nodded, though my pulse still hadn't settled. "Yeah, probably." He hesitated for just a second longer, his eyes searching mine, as if waiting for something. Then, finally, he stepped back fully, his presence retreating but not disappearing entirely. As he turned and walked toward the doorway, I let out a slow, measured breath, pressing my palms against the edge of the sink. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything felt different now. And somehow I knew this wasn't the end of it. The silence in the kitchen stretched long after Jake had stepped away. My fingers lingered in the soapy water, though I wasn't washing anything anymore. My pulse hadn't settled, my skin still warm where his touch had been. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to rinse the last plate, but my mind was elsewhere, stuck on the quiet shift between us, the way his voice had lowered, the way he hadn't let go right away. A chair scraped against the floor behind me, the sound grounding me back to the moment. I glanced over my shoulder and found Jake sitting at the counter, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Done for the night?" he asked, nodding toward the now empty sink. I wiped my hands on a towel, hesitating before answering. "I think so." Jake's gaze lingered. "Good. You deserve a break." I let out a small breathy laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know how to do that." His lips quirked into a knowing smirk. "Yeah, I noticed." The air between us was still thick, still charged. The same awareness from before hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper, sinking into the quiet space between words, making every glance, every breath feel heavier. I should have changed the subject. I should have laughed it off. But instead, I let my fingers trace the rim of my glass, my own quiet hesitation filling the silence. "You've been different lately," Jake murmured, watching me closely. More distant. I swallowed. "Have I?" He nodded, eyes never leaving mine. "Yeah." I couldn't tell if it was an accusation or an observation, but either way, it made my stomach tighten. "It's nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. Jake didn't look convinced. "I don't think that's true." I shifted, leaning back against the counter, suddenly feeling too exposed under his gaze. "Jake, you don't have to explain anything," he interrupted, his voice quieter now. "I just don't like seeing you like this. Like you're carrying something alone." A lump formed in my throat. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like he meant them, like he had noticed more than he should have. I inhaled deeply, gripping the counter behind me, my knuckles tightening against the smooth surface. "I'm fine." He watched me for another long moment before nodding, though I knew he didn't believe me. "Okay," he said simply. And then, before I could say anything else, he stood, his presence suddenly closer again. My breath hitched when his fingers brushed lightly against mine, just for a second, just enough to send a quiet shiver through me. He could have moved away. He should have. But he didn't. His fingers lingered, barely touching, a silent question in the space between us. My heart pounded. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. His jaw was tense, his eyes darker than before, but he didn't say anything. Neither did I. Without another word, he walked toward the hallway, his footsteps quiet against the floor. The air he left behind felt hollow, colder somehow, as if something unspoken had been left hanging between us. I stood there for a long time after he left, my fingers still tingling where his had been. Nothing had happened. And yet I knew this wasn't over. Not yet.